Hi, everybody. Welcome to the October Academic Life in Emergency Medicine Book Club. We are so excited this time around to talk about Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic by Sam Quinones. For this round of our book club, we are actually so lucky to be able to feature the author himself, along with our expert panel of chief residents and toxicology experts in emergency medicine around the country. So we're just going to jump right into the first question, which is, what were the origins of the subject of the book? And we're going to go around and give everyone a chance to talk, go through the questions, and let everyone reflect on it. But most of all, give Sam a chance to give his insight as an author as to the background of the book and what he was thinking. So the first question is, what were the origins of the subject of the book? But before I get into that, I wanted to ask Rory to give a synopsis and why he picked this book in the first place. So go ahead, Rory.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us. This is great. You know, here in Dayton, unfortunately, we have our fair share of prescription opioid abuse and heroin abuse, and you know, I think the degree of the problem is really flabbergasting. You know, the amount of you know, opioid addicted patients that we see in the ED on a daily and nightly basis, and of course the horrible problems with heroin that followed after that. I think, like most providers, once I was exposed to this, I just was, you know, shocked at the sheer magnitude of the issue, and kind of wondered where this all came from, because it really did seem like it just appeared all of a sudden. We had all these opioid addicted patients and heroin addicts that were just kind of coming out of the woodwork. And Dr. Mann, who's a staff toxicologist here, you know, suggested that I look at Dreamland. This was last summer. And so I picked it up and was excited to see that Sam was the author, because I had read another one of his books called True Tales from Another Mexico and really enjoyed that. So once I started reading this book, I was absolutely hooked. You know, just fascinating. Not only, you know, the degree of investigative journalism that Sam did to get all this together, but really, you know, his ability to kind of weave this story where on one side you have the emergence of the kind of modern pharmaceutical industry and this direct-to-consumer marketing and all the issues that go along with that, but then also the, you know, the emergence of cheap, readily available heroin from Mexico, and basically how these two things combined to just create this epidemic we're in right now. It's just absolutely fascinating. I think anyone who works in emergency medicine or medicine in general should really read this book to have a better understanding of the things that we're seeing on a daily basis out there.
Yeah, I agree completely, Rory. And thank you so much for picking the book. So let's actually turn it over to Sam to kind of understand the history of the book, where it came from. So what were the origins of the subject? And I'm really curious, the research that went into this must have been so immense.
Yes. Can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
We can hear you, Sam.
Okay. Everybody?
Yep, we can all hear you.
Okay. Okay, fine. Okay, good. Well, I'm sorry about this technical. I'm not really sure what's going on with my computer. I was just on a FaceTime thing on the computer last night. It was working perfectly, so I really don't know what's going on. But anyway, to answer your question, this book began really because of my time in Mexico. I had spent the years 1994 to 2004 in Mexico, and those were the years when there was a major change in pain treatment, and the really very strong, I would say, excessive use of opiate painkillers for pain kind of became conventional wisdom. I knew nothing of that, not one thing, because I was in Mexico. I was very focused on writing about immigration, about political change in Mexico, is where he said I wrote True Tales, writing another book about immigration stories. That came out in 2007. And so my mind was completely taken up with Mexico, and I knew nothing of these pills. I did not know what oxycontin was. I did not know what Vicodin was, any of that stuff. And it began really as a part of a team of reporters. I came back in 2004 to Mexico to work with the Los Angeles Times, The Mexican drug war kicked off in about 2005, really. And in 2008, I was put on a team of reporters to write about the drug war. My job was to write about how drugs were trafficked once they crossed the border into the United States, after they crossed over. And this was in '08. In '09, I was looking around the internet, really, for some stories, other stories I might do. I've done already a few on this topic. And I came upon these overdoses of black tar heroin in Huntington, West Virginia, and I read the book. I don't really want to go into too much on that. But my approach was to kind of back into the story. I did not start with pain pills. I knew nothing about them. I started with the question of why are heroin traffickers from Mexico doing such good business? And I had been in Phoenix several months before and spoken with a DEA chief out there, and she said that the heroin seizures were way up and continuing to rise. And I kind of filed this in the back of my mind, and it wasn't until I saw those stories out of Huntington that I remembered our conversation and what she had told me about heroin. And I began to think, why is this? What's going on here? And what's more, what also struck me was that black tar heroin was east of the Mississippi River. That was really a big deal to me because I had known black tar heroin to be really only on the west coast or the western side of the United States. So why was it in Huntington? And then, of course, the big question was, why was there any demand at all for heroin in Huntington, West Virginia? And I knew, as I said, I knew nothing about the pills, but as time began mentioning them, and so I began to think about the pain revolution, pain as a fifth vital sign, the Joint Commission, any of that kind of stuff I knew nothing of. So that was really my learning curve. I knew a lot about Mexican villages. I knew a lot about Mexican immigration and Mexican drug trafficking go together hand in hand. They're motivated by the same impulses, the same realities on the ground in Mexico, and so I felt I knew a lot about this. And when, of course, the guy told me that these guys had this really innovative system, and that this system was impossible to eradicate, and by the way, they were all from the same town, I was very well positioned to hear that because I'd done so many stories about Mexico. I knew so many places where everybody in one town had the same job. In my first book, in True Tales, I wrote about the town where everybody made popsicles, and their popsicle business model went all over the country, and it's everywhere in Mexico. Now, you really can't go to a town that doesn't have a popsicle shop based on this business model that this one town invented, and everybody in the town makes popsicles. There's a town also that I want to write about called well, the issue in the town is that everybody in the town, including the women, are pimps. Everybody pimps. They go around looking for young girls in Mexico, naive country girls, take them, kind of pimp them out, and then send them to Queens, New York. And it's a very big problem in Queens, New York. You can, if you look into it. Name of that town is Tenancingo. If you like to look that up, it's really an outrageous little crappy town. Because had done all these stories, and because of my time in Mexico, I was, I guess, well positioned to hear what this officer, this agent, was telling me. And so, from that point, I wrote a story about the LA Times 3-part series that appeared in 2010 about this town, Jalisco, in the state of Nayarit, and their system for selling heroin like pizza that they'd expanded all over America, 20 states, maybe even 25 states, depending.
A few states, they come in, they go, I just heard a new case that I was unaware of in Charleston, West Virginia, where they were for a long time.
One second, Sam. It says, Alex, you accidentally muted Sam.
Well, we were just trying to eliminate the echo because we're actually, I think we're getting Sam's audio now.
He muted me, actually.
Okay.
So
if his audio, you can take the phone off.
So that then led to my idea that
Oh yeah, I see. Okay, go ahead.
There we go. That then led to my this hunch that this was a much bigger story. I began to realize, although I did not have a time to write this into the story that I wrote for the LA Times, that the pills were the problem, and that was a new thing for me. And so I began to research that, and why would that be, and how would that be? And as time went on, I began to realize that this could well be a book, and this was a national story, and that heroin, wherever I every 2-3 months I do more Google searches, and I'd hear heroin popping up in Alabama or in South Dakota or Wyoming or wherever, just crazy places that you never think of heroin ever appearing, and there was. And eventually wrote a book proposal. As I got into the book proposal, that's what introduced me to the whole concept of the history of pain, pain management. Is my real quick? Is my computer working now?
It's working, Sam. The phone. We don't need the phone thing anymore.
Great. Is everybody hearing me now? Well,
we can hear you, Sam.
Okay, great, wonderful, thank you. Anyway, that began, as I said, my real learning curve. I had no. I began to talk to doctors. I began to talk with pain specialists. There's here at UCLA in Los Angeles. There's a pain historian, Marsha Meldrum. She was very helpful in allowing me to understand what was behind all this. And I realized that a few things. One that the guys from Jalisco were actually a perfect paradigm for what was going on. That this was a new way of their way was a new way of trafficking drugs. It was not involved. It did not involve shootouts, Scarface or the Bloods and the Crips or the Prohibition Boys in the 1920s, with their drive-by shootings and their public slaughters and all that kind of stuff. That this was a far more insidious way of trafficking, and that it used marketing and branding and also customer service, all of this into a kind of a franchise system, and that this was actually very emblematic of the way the pills had also been pushed. It seemed to me like there were two stories, but they were very connected. One was the guys from Jalisco, and the other were the push to liberalize and aggressively promote the prescribing of pain pills to the rest of the country, but using marketing, using branding, using customer, these kinds of ideas. Telling doctors that had a terrible problem with pain patients that this was their solution, the one to stick with, the solution to stick with, which is pills and oxycontin in particular. And I began to see the real parallels between these two systems. And that really intrigued me. That I was already hooked, but that really, I swallowed the bait right there. That was like, wow, this is a whole different way of thinking about drug trafficking. Like, who is the cartel here? That's a good question, I think, to come out of this. But so that was kind of the way the book got going. I would say that initially, though, when I would tell people what I was working on, they would get this kind of glassy-eyed look and kind of nod, and either they wouldn't know what I was talking about, or they would feel sorry for me, like, oh, why'd you sign a contract to write a book about that? Who uses heroin? Nobody uses heroin in America anymore, And I'm like, well, I beg to differ. I think that's wrong. And I thought that there was a formula that wherever you found pills, you would soon find heroin, and I think that's what we're seeing now. But back when I started this in 2011 and then got the contract in 2012, people weren't just like clueless about it, honestly, and of course I no longer get those looks. I get a lot of looks like, oh wow, great, how did you figure this out before everybody, that kind of thing, because there isn't really any other books I think out on this topic yet. So but that's kind of how I came to it. It started with Mexico. I backed into it through heroin and got to the pills rather than pills to heroin, which is how most people did.
That's amazing. Your descriptions of the towns in Mexico also are quite fascinating. Does anybody want to add anything right now?
I thought it was really an eye-opening account of what was going on from the user side and from the heroin and OxyContin supply side. The other folks on this call, Sam, are physicians, and we've all been really profoundly affected professionally by what's evolved over the past decade or so, and we've watched in our own practices opioid and heroin overdose be something almost exotic, although maybe some folks on this call do remember the sort of urban heroin epidemic from prior decades. But I wasn't practicing then, and seeing problems with opioids was pretty rare. And then over the past 10 years, this has become not just a daily part of our practice, but multiple patients per shift affected by this, either from the sense of acute toxicity of opioids, but much more commonly issues around addiction and the way that opioids change the way that you feel pain, and the heightened sensitivity to pain that these patients suffer with has been an incredible change for us, and we've had to rethink the way that we use opioids. Your book is an incredible complement to that for us by giving us an account of not what we see from us to the patients, but how the patients get involved with opioids, how they obtain opioids, and then how they transition to heroin. It's an incredible piece of reporting, and you should be very proud.
Well, thank you very much. That's really wonderful to hear that, I have to say, because it was a pretty lonely task for a long time. I was just out there on my own, my wife and my daughter and me, basically, kind of this team around this book. Although my daughter wasn't quite aware of what it was. She's 9, and so, I did not. I set out to write a story that I thought was interesting and amazing, and I thought was nationwide too. I did not think was just one place in the country, but was all over the country. I was very limited in time and very limited in budget, extraordinarily limited in budget, or I'd have talked to a whole bunch more people. I walk down the street now, and I'll be hit. It'll hit me like, damn, I should have talked to that one guy, But you do what you do, and then you do what you can, and so. But it makes me feel very, very good that this is helping doctors, because I know. I mean, I spent some time talking about the pill mill docs who are mostly quacks, or more precisely, what I think happened with the pill mill docs case had their ethics just completely worn away like the sea on the sand, And after a while, many of them were in places where they were very, very economically depressed, and they just kind of got withered away and became the corrupt, civilized. That those people, those doctors, were about less than really a minuscule percentage of the overall doctor population, and that most doctors were trying to help people, and that this whole thing grew out of that desire to help people, to relieve pain, to and under the conditions and the limitations that the doctors were placed, and that was part of the story. That this was, I was not looking for. I believe journalism really fails, and we fail a lot these days when we look for bogeymen. Like the villain, the easy villain, the Snidely Whiplash or whatever of the story. It's far more. What would I say? It's far more nuanced, but far more real, to look for people who were really trying to do the right thing, and it just didn't quite work out, And that's kind of what I feel the case to be. I was in Cincinnati last week, and I spoke to a bunch of internists and residents, young docs and so on, and they were alarmed. They were like, we feel as if an older generation just got these. We're seeing. We're on huge doses of opioids, hundreds and hundreds of milligrams a day, and these guys were young. I mean, I don't think there were any who were over 30, Didn't seem that way anyway. And they were saying, you know, it seems to us like a whole generation of docs got these people addicted, and then we're left holding the bag, and we don't really know what to do with them. And I will say also, though, that yeah, as you know, and I want to be very clear, I am a complete layman on this. I do not presume to any medical expertise or anything like that. I know what I've been told, what other people tell me, and I try to talk to as many people as possible so that knowledge is deep, but it's not like a practicing doctor or anything like that. Just a caveat there. So.
Well, we appreciate your input, layman or not, because, you know, as Ruben says, we are all doctors on this panel, but what we see is so complicated, and I think, you know, to just blame an older generation of doctors also is not the right answer. Addiction medicine is complicated, and this issue is more complicated than just simply medicine. It, like you saw, it goes into the socioeconomics and crosses culture boundaries. So, and you're right, I don't think any doctor goes out with the worst intentions, but the outcomes are so terrible. Did you all see the case in LA of the doctor who's being persecuted? This was in the news recently. She had a clinic that was essentially like in a strip mall. They described it in the news article, where she just gave out prescriptions, and a young man from Arizona drove up, overdosed, died, and his parents sued her as a result of it.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the fourth question, which is talking more about the oxycontin economy and what factors led to it. How were the towns affected by it, and what are your perspectives on that?
That was really the place where I found that most was in Portsmouth, Ohio, which I believe was not coincidental because Portsmouth also had the highest per capita number of pill mills in the country, and so the sheer amount of pills that were being prescribed in that town was mind-boggling. Millions and millions of pills. This is a town of 20,000 people. Millions and millions of pills were being prescribed out of that town for more than a decade, until 2011. So 98, let's say 98 roughly to 2011 when they finally closed them all down. But I believe several things. Now, keeping in mind that Portsmouth is almost like at the exact center of what I would consider to be like the I don't know, ground zero of this whole problem. If you take Columbus to the north, Wheeling and Cincinnati to the east and to the west, and all of eastern Kentucky, that's where we first see this problem really breaking out the way we're seeing it now all across the country. That was really like the canary in the coal mine, just no one was paying attention because we were used to not paying attention to Appalachia. It's just not, doesn't, you know, this is an area full of dysfunction, right? So no one pays attention. And it's also a part of the Rust Belt, too. There's a number of towns that have lost major industries, factories. A lot of factories have gone from that area along the Ohio River. It's just terrible. What has, and so it gets to really the concept that I think is crucial in all this, which is the concept of community. That without community, you do not have the defenses against this. And the heroin thrives. The heroin's natural habitat, I believe, is a town where that has no community, that has been where everyone's kind of isolated. And that's frankly why we see it all across the country too. I mean, we see it across the country because our country is we are so isolated. We built suburbs that are extraordinarily isolated. No one's on the street. No one knows each other. And we call that prosperity. So it's in the suburbs. It's in Portsmouth, Ohio, which is a devastated town economically, but it's also in the wealthy suburbs of Charlotte or Portland or wherever you like to go. So the OxyContin economy, though, was my way of talking about the worst of the pain revolution, and as well as what happens when you have your community just shredded the way that did. And my theory was that this would not have gotten going as quickly, at least, had they had a diverse economic ecosystem in Portsmouth. They used to have a lot of businesses along Main Street, and now all those businesses, those businesses, had this happened when those businesses were still alive, those addicts would have had a hell of a time making their daily nut to get OxyContin, because those businesses were locally owned. They knew the addict, they would have known the addicts, and they would have come to work every day ready to defend their stores. And what's more, an addict would have had to go from place to place to place. Remember, an OxyContin addiction is extraordinarily expensive. You have to make $150 to $200 every day without working to make your OxyContin nut. And doing that by going from store to store to store is very different. Now, with the destruction of the Portsmouth economy, the destruction of the community, the only place left to buy stuff was Walmart. And Walmart had the added advantage of having everything under one roof. So you could steal steaks and children's clothes and an Xbox all on the same trip and sell that to your dealer and make your nut that way. And a lot of people did that. And that the OxyContin economy really grew up because there was an enormous supply of pills in the town, far exceeding, just millions of pills. So that was like the money supply. They were perfectly denominated, so you'd have a perk 5, perk 10, Vicodin 20, whatever it was. You'd have the oxycodone 30s, you'd have the OxyContin 40s and 80s, and for a while there was 160. You had all these pills that were easy to, they didn't disintegrate really very easily, so they're greatest currency. So after a while, you could buy anything you needed to live with pills in Portsmouth, Ohio, and this included cable service, dental appointments, cars, refrigerators. Everything was paid for. People would be robbed, and the robbers would not take the cash. They'd take only the pills. And it also worked because there was one place through where you could steal everything you needed to make your money, and that other people needed to get by, and that was Walmart. So you had a combination of economic decline with massive supply of pills and addicting virtually an entire generation of the town and really in the county, and eventually you had this economy break out. That was really kind of a symptom of the economic and decline and the community, the shredding of community that had gone on. But the stories from those days are amazing. That people would set up special stores made up of products stolen from Walmart. So one woman, I heard several of these stories. One woman had like a whole in her apartment. She had a whole room filled with baby goods, onesies and diapers and all of it stolen from Walmart. And she would then trade these for pills or money, usually pills, out of her store. And she would trade, she just had a bartering business for pills, where she would either trade or in one way or another the pills for what she had taken in from shoplifters. And all of this was just without any cash. The cash really didn't matter. Once you're addicted, again, the only thing that matters is that dope, and that's what people were after, and that's how the economy in Portsmouth functioned for a while.
It was an incredible account of the OxyContin economy. Right when at the same time that you were describing that economy, Sam, you also were describing the role of Medicare and Medicaid in how that contributed to the sort of explosion of OxyContin in that town. Could you just recount that? And also, I'm interested in elements of that aspect of the OxyContin economy that maybe you didn't put into the book, like your personal reaction, because that does sort of affect how we think from a policy perspective and how we distribute Medicare and Medicaid resources.
Right. Pills change the reason why you would want Well, first of all, let me back up. For a long time, this economy has been flat on its back for a long time. So people who used to work, who stayed, a lot of people left, of course. They moved on. The place depopulated significantly for a long time. But those people who stayed, finding no work, began to resort to sometimes SSDI, but mostly SSI, as a life strategy, as a way of getting by. You couldn't find any work, so you just, very early on, you would go on SSI and get your $500 and $700 a month. Of course, that doesn't pay for much. Along come the pills and widespread addiction, And all of a sudden, the whole calculus for why you would want SSI changes. The $500 to $700 a month paycheck, of course, is welcome, but the real reason you want it is because SSI gives you a Medicaid insurance card, and that has a prescription a prescription drug benefit that allows you to go to a doctor to get prescribed drugs that the doctor says that you need for whatever condition you might have, whether it's real or fictitious, I guess in this case, and that you could then go to a pharmacist and pay a $3 copay and get $800 to $1,200 to $1,500 worth of drugs given to you for that copay. So that the whole calculus of why you wanted to be on SSI was changed with the pills. Now, there was already, however, a deep culture of going to SSI. I mean, it shouldn't be. It's not like this was created by the pill issue. It just was the reason why you went to SSI was changed. Ended up doing. I mean, they didn't make the money that they thought they would make. A lot of people went into it with like dreams of making a lot of cash, but addiction takes over, and pretty soon you're just using all your dope. And what ends up happening is the few people who don't end up using become tenant farmers, or landlord farmers during the sharecropping days. So they have a job where their business is taking these addicts who have the Medicaid card to the doctor to get the prescription each month, and then driving them to a pharmacy. And after a while, they had to drive for many miles, hours sometimes, because the pharmacists in the local area were onto this, and they weren't playing along anymore. And you would drive 5, 6 addicts at a time, all of them with prescriptions with a legitimate value of, say, say $800 to $1,000, but with a street value, the pills that they had prescriptions for would be $5,000 to $10,000. Now, after a while, a relationship developed between these folks who never got addicted, and there were a few of them, and all the addicts that they would drive around constantly, and they became kind of like a sharecropping relationship, where the addict, to get through the month, would have to constantly be begging pills or getting the guy to loan him pills. And as time went on, the month proceeded, he would basically use up almost his entire allotment of pills that he was going to get prescribed from this one doctor. And so by the time he was being driven around by this guy who had loaned him pills all through the month, that guy basically, because of the deal that they would make, usually if you get a pill from somebody during the month, you owe him 2 in exchange later. So he gives you an OxyContin 40, you owe him 2 OxyContin 40s at the end of the month. So there was a sharecropping almost existence a relationship that existed between these folks, where people would have to pay off their debt at the end of the month, and that would mean that almost all the pills that they were about to use, that they were about to get, they had already owed to this driver, this guy who would shepherd them around and pay for their. This guy would also pay for their doctor appointment, usually $250 for each, and then he would take. Usually, what he would do, the standard deal was, I will drive you around. I will drive you to the doctor. I will pay for the doctor's visit. You'll go in. You'll get your prescription. $800 to $1,000 worth of legitimately priced pills, and then I'll drive you to a pharmacist, and we'll get that thing filled. Now, in exchange for that, I get half of what you get, out of that. In exchange for me doing all that, I get half. But as time went on, the addict would end up using up all of the pills that he would get at the end of the month. So by the time the end of the month came around, and the guy was driving him to the different appointments, to the doctor and then to the pharmacist, that addict would have to turn over almost all his pills to the driver, and at that point he would be back where he started. He'd be having to beg pills at a 2-for-1 rate, and so that was all. But that was all almost entirely based on the idea that you could pay $3 copay with your Medicaid card and get all those pills, and that's where the huge profit came in. And all of a sudden, people who had worked in factories or coal mines or really had not worked at all, kids growing up, had really no jobs at all. They just kind of went on to SSI. This happened all over that area I was talking about, Portsmouth a lot, but also in eastern Kentucky and various places, West Virginia, places like that. The Medicaid card was a huge lift to this whole problem. It got it going, I think, in large measure.
Sam, do you know the physician's role in getting patients on SSI?
Oh, well, see, this is what I was talking to earlier about the pill mill docs. A lot of the doctors who came to that area, and remember, this is an area in dire need of health practitioners, of all kinds. Most people have left. When the jobs leave, when the factories leave, a lot of doctors leave too. So they're begging for people. A lot of people come to that area, and then who come to that area and grow up in it, or their practice matures within it, get just simply worn down. They are constantly being approached by people who need them to kind of fudge a workers' comp claim, or fudge an SSDI claim, or all kinds of. You're constantly being a problem. They may have a medical problem, but their basic problem is economic. And as a doctor, a well-meaning, compassionate doctor, you want to do something about that, and after a while, the need is such, the numbers are such, that you begin to go along with it. You know it's not quite right, but what else are you going to do? These people are in real economic need, and this is part of the problem. And so what ends up happening then is, after a while, some doctors, and not all of them, but some of them just get their morals completely eroded. 20 years doing that, and you will come out a different person. And that's what happened with a lot of these folks. I kind of actually, as notorious and as scandalous as some of these doctors were down there, I do kind of feel for them. I felt that they were in the middle of an area where they were almost all alone, and they had legions of people coming to them begging them for help and winking, kind of, well, this is what I kind of need, and the understanding was, well, you probably don't apply, but I'll write it anyway. And after a while, you just get your morals and ethics just corroded. And I believe that's what happens. But yeah, eventually those folks are writing SSI applications like nothing, and workers' comp completely, all the time. And then a lot of them, just a few of them, evolve into pill mill docs, doctors whose practice is based on the idea that federal law requires you to, as a patient, to get these pills, you have to present this massive push by medicine to say, that this is what we should be doing, and you're really failing for not prescribing this. All of these things kind of combine to convince these doctors, little by little, that it's not that bad what I'm doing, and then eventually they end up corrupted, honestly, and of course then they become truly corrupted. And in the case of like David Proctor, the investigations into him showed, trading sex for drugs and horrible manipulation of very, very vulnerable people. I don't believe that's how he started out, though.
It was hard for me to mount any sort of sympathy for him, especially when he tried to charge you for speaking with him.
Yeah, that was weird. I wrote to the guy because, I always write to people in prison. By the way, prison is where I found most of this story. I mean, I spent a lot of time in prisons or writing to people in prisons. You can find amazing stories when you reach out to people in prison or jail, for that matter. And I've done a lot of my reporting out of prison or jail. But he was locked up in the prison that had been the federal narcotics farm, which was also, of course, a fascinating part of this I had no idea about until I got into it. And so I was going down. I was going to be in that area. I was in Indianapolis for Christmas 2012, and I figured, well, I'll swing down, go visit the farm, and maybe I can get an interview with Dr. Proctor. And he said no. But then, of course, he got out, and I think he's in Toronto now. And then he wanted money, and I'm like, well, man, there's no way I'm paying you a dime. So we left it at that. And he wants to be friends on LinkedIn, though. I guess he just got a message from wanting to be friends on LinkedIn. So maybe hey, who knows? I'm quite sure that whatever David Proctor has to say, particularly about the drug companies, would be pretty damn interesting. But you know, you get what you can, and you go from there.
Stephen, do you have any input? Do you have any questions you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, you know, again, as has already been stated, I just love the book. I thought, you know, as a doc who watched the big heroin boom back in the 90s, and never in my career did I imagine that prescription drugs would outstrip it in terms of causing deaths throughout the country. And then now we're just seeing the swing go backwards as the economic forces are collapsing. It's just stunning. And your take on the pharmaceutical industry and how we got there I thought it was spot on. Everything from JACO, etc. You know, since we're talking about the OxyContin economy, like I think this book in some way read as an economic story. You got the poor kids from Jalisco; they've got no opportunity down there, and you juxtapose that with the people in Portsmouth, that their opportunity is declining as well. So it's sort of a clash of lack of economic opportunity for people. And then you've got Pharma, who is obviously the big gorilla in this, trying to do something else. I was just wondering, you know, how did you compare that in your head?
I thought of I'm always looking for nuance. That's really where I live. I think that's where you find the most exciting stories. Too often, and certainly on TV, it's who's the bad guy, that kind of crap. I just can't bear that stuff. And it's like everything's a soap opera. You know, there's black and white, nothing in between. I think we live in the gray areas. That's where what's really important, and where the stories are. And so I thought of this as another take on drug trafficking, on another take on twin tales of drug marketing now, though. Yeah. And I thought that this was very different. I had my first job as a crime reporter. My first job was in Stockton, California, as a crime reporter during the crack days, the crack years of '89, '90, '91, '92. And I mean, everything was so public, drive-by shootings, very massive, you know, public violence. And I just associated that with drug problems with public violence, with the Colombians coming into Miami in the '80s, with the Al Capone years, you know, all that stuff. It was very public violence all the time. And so I thought this was fascinating because this was about a very, very different, far more insidious, far more potent way of trafficking drugs, which was not with a gun, but by marketing, branding, using all that we know about psychology to do this. And I thought that the history of pharmaceutical marketing eventually became an important part of this story that I did not know, and strangely, it dovetailed perfectly because the pioneer of pharmaceutical marketing was one of the Sackler brothers, who then went on to buy OxyContin, and then went on to buy Purdue Pharma, and this man, Arthur Sackler, very well known in his field, transformed pharmaceutical marketing years and years before all this story by taking on he did Valium. He was the one who marketed Valium, made it the first billion-dollar drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry, almost exclusively by direct marketing to doctors, going to their office and say, hey doc, how about using this, or how about prescribing this? This solves a problem for you. He really understood that what you had to do as a pharmaceutical company was tell doctors how you were able to solve one of their problems in their practices. And Valium did that. They promoted OxyContin quite the same way. And so the pharmaceutical promotion, particularly for the first 6-7 years, when that was really outrageous. But that's when it was all getting started anyway. I mean, those were the crucial years. You know, they essentially marketed an opiate almost like an over-the-counter drug to doctors. They didn't market it to us as citizens, but to doctors certainly. And it's really important to note that I didn't know any of this, but I learned it as you go along. That's why journalism is so fun. You know, Tom Wolfe said, "Don't write about what you know, write about what you don't know, but you're going to find out all about it." And that's kind of how this book's pretty much that. But during those years, I come to find out, those were years when there was this pharmaceutical sales force arms race that took place. That was also a big part of the story because, you know, we went from like 30,000 drug reps in the early 90s to 120,000 drug reps all across the country 10 years later. All of them just pushing blockbuster drugs. And Purdue wasn't even by any means the largest in this. I mean, Pfizer had, I think, 12,000 drug sales reps in the United States. This is a huge amount. I think Purdue had 1,000 at the peak. But nevertheless, what they were promoting, not to say pushing, but what they were promoting was an addictive, intensely addictive drug that they had to convince doctors was no longer addictive under certain circumstances. And the way they did that was, of course, pointing to the pain specialists over here who had just spent a decade trying to get people to liberalize the use of opiates and hiring them or paying them off or however you want to put it. I've heard both. Paying their research for their research or whatever. But I would say that the idea that they kind of bought these guys off is incorrect. I would say that it was more like a confluence of interests. The doctors wanted to liberalize the opiates, and the company had lots of money to promote that message, and had a new drug, oxycontin, that was time-release oxycodone, that was a good tool. A lot of them applauded it, said 3 cheers for OxyContin. We've got a new tool with which to manage pain, and that largely they were correct about a lot of that. But that's kind of where this the whole story of pharma is all wrapped up in that time. Both the emergence of the pain revolution as well as the Salesforce arms race that I talk about.
Right, and I just wanted to just comment. I absolutely loved your portrayal of the Herschel Jick's article and how that was misconstrued. And for those of us training the next generation of doctors, it's the onus on us to go back to the sources and read what the evidence is. And I just thought that was such a great lesson for physicians and physicians in training.
I have to tell you, there's 2 things about this that just stunned me. One, and that was the first one. I spent like a month telling myself this could not possibly be true. This could not possibly be true that this one letter, 101 words, was the cornerstone of an intellectual revolution, the intellectual cornerstone of a revolution in modern medicine. That cannot possibly be the case. And the more I talked to people, the more they said, yes, it was. And people who know, I'm a reporter. I'm not a doctor. I talk to people who know what they're talking about, and I talk to a lot of them, and over people would tell me this, like, yeah, no, that was pretty much, it was gospel. We quoted it, and people would kind of like, no one went to look it up, of course. 1980, New England Journal of Medicine, it's away in some dusty library. No one's going to go look that up. It's not online back then either. There is no online, really, or it's just beginning. And that just was a stunning story. And also that when I called him, and he says, I had forgotten about that letter. And that letter meant nothing to me. It was just like a note. Like, hey, FYI, this is what I found in my database. The truth is, here's the truth, that letter was grotesquely misinterpreted, because the real interpretation ought to be, the more you control opiate use and prescribing and keep it in hospital and make sure that it's judiciously used, then you get less addiction. But they interpret it to mean, I think perhaps because of the headline or because of wishful thinking, I don't know exactly all their thinking, but basically that this was a reason to believe that you could send people home with bottles of 60 Vicodin and have no problem.
Right.
It was a complete misinterpretation. The other thing that surprised me about this was that today, and I would be happy to know that I'm not right about this, but I think I am. There is no journal, no convention, no seminar, no CME or anything that combine pain specialists, addiction specialists, and family practitioners. Like, there is no journal of pain, addiction, and family practice. Now, those 3, to me, again, we're getting back to kind of larger philosophical issues of community here, where this drug really spreads because of isolation, because of fragmentation. But it's also true that it seems to me that in medicine this is a real grave problem. that you have this siloization. You know, everybody in pain talks to each other, but they don't know anybody in addiction. And the people in addiction talk to each other, but they don't know anybody in family practice or in pain. You know. And
well, Sam,
so
I could tell you that when I read that, when you wrote that in your book, the thought that I had at that time was, well, this is the role of toxicology. And toxicology is, I'm not sure how much you know about toxicology. We have 2 toxicologists on the phone right now. And but toxicology is a multidisciplinary specialty that is the clinical science of toxins. And it's an interesting, almost like a challenge now to toxicologists. And I think that many of them have stepped up, including some of the guys on this call, to try to fill that role of bridging the different the addiction medicine, the pain medicine, and I feel like some of the most important champions that we've had in the past 5 years in terms of trying to reverse the damage that you chart over the past 20 years. I think a lot of that has come from toxicology.
Dennis, do you want to put any input into that?
I think for me, this whole thing started in 2000, late 2000, 2001, when I looked at my first chart that had a pain scale on it. The top of my head almost exploded. And I was working in Detroit at the time, and we didn't have time for that nonsense at Detroit Receiving Hospital in downtown inner city Detroit. So I went up to the charge nurse, and I'm like, what the hell is this? And she says, because one day there was no pain scale, the next day every single chart had a pain scale on it, and it was filled in all the time. So for me, it started the whole thing there, and my questioning about how that came to be, and why we were doing it, and what was the point, what was the motivation. As the years rolled by, it finally became very clear that JCO had mandated that, Federation of State Medical Boards was in on it, and they had looks like they had received financial backing from Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical concerns as really part of their overall marketing strategy for OxyContin. That being said, for many years, I think I and many other doctors who were not interested at all in prescribing opiates for chronic pain felt kind of out in the wilderness because of the pain revolution. We were just kind of steamrolled by just the landslide of information saying that all pain must be treated. Even really the American College of Emergency Physicians was on board with this completely. For many years, their policy was that all pain should be treated, and if you suspected a drug seeker, you were still not to deny, just in case that the person was legitimate. So the House of Medicine really has been very, very, I would say, intimately involved in this, and an active participant in the whole push to overtreat pain. Essentially, is what happened. It just sort of was very predictable from even back in 2001 when you started to see the pain scale and why it showed up. What was the motivation behind it? It wasn't to assess pain. The motivation was to sell drugs. Really, it was just part of their marketing strategy. Actually, worked spectacularly well, I must say.
That it did, and that's why I found it so interesting. It was very similar to my guys, the Jalisco boys. Honestly, the kind of everything you do is pointed to the idea of keeping your patient, your customer in their case, alive and buying, and that's. I mean, I saw in some kind of fundamental way, I saw almost. Well, very little difference between the heroin traffickers out of Mexico and a lot of what was done in the name of promoting the solution to the pain epidemic and marketing by Purdue, also others, and in the industry. That was a startling idea to me when I first had it, and it was what got me. That's kind of what got me really rolling on it. This was a huge huge story and very different. It helped that I had come from crime and writing about drug trafficking and immigration, all that kind of stuff, because I was used to a certain discourse about cartels, you know, and we were seeing it very, very vividly down in Mexico. Heads being chopped off, people hung from overpasses, big piles of bodies, and all that kind of stuff. When really the way drugs are trafficked by Mexico, I think this is kind of the new paradigm, is very quietly. You don't have drive-by shootings. You don't have big piles of bodies in the United States, you know. And there's another way of doing it, and these guys from Jalisco had mastered it, and I believe the folks from Purdue kind of did the same.
Yeah, for me, I actually think that the whole pain revolution was actually part of the marketing strategy. They certainly pushed that. They got focus groups. They paid for patient-centered focus groups from Purdue, and the other endo pharmacy was in there as well.
Yes.
And, you know, they funded the pain societies, got the whole drum roll going, and got the attention of the federal government. And finally, the Clintons declared the decade of pain control, which really got rolling. So that's pretty much, I think, how we ended up where we are now. Fascinating story, though.
Alex, do you have anything that you want to add into this? And then we'll wrap it up soon. This has been a great discussion, and Sam, I want to thank you for your time, but I don't want to take up all your time.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I thought was great and most striking here was the parallels you were describing between the drug companies and the Jalisco boys. The drug companies visiting physicians' offices almost sounded exactly like the Jalisco boys going to methadone clinics and handing out samples of their products right there in line. The other thing was that I almost saw, from their perspective, this is almost like an American Dream type story. We see it as a right for everybody to come in and try and make their money, make their mark, create a company, something like that, and these guys come from nothing and see a way to get out of that. So it almost makes them more human in a way. The big thing that I wanted to discuss is that in the future, I mean, right now it seems like with the pendulum swinging from the era of pain control back to curtailing it a little bit, we've almost pushed ourselves into a corner where I'll see a patient who wants a certain strength of oxycontin or something prescribed. I refuse to prescribe it, and then they tell me that's fine, I'll just go score on the street. So I don't really know where we're going to go in the future with this. If we curtail it, they'll go to illicit drugs. If we don't, then we're still just feeding into the hysteria. And it seems at this point all we can do is almost symptomatically control that with, you know, preventing deaths from overdose. And I'm just wondering where we think we should go from here.
Well, my feeling is every doctor is an individual, and you know, whatever happens in society happens. You don't have control over that, but basically you have to behave, and I'm not even sure if I should even be saying this. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but honestly, it feels to me like every human being has the responsibility to behave ethically, and if other people down the road don't, well, what can you do about that? That's not you can't control that so much. You know, to me, that's really the way you know, everybody has to behave and just say, look, I can't do this, and eventually that person will kind of come to it. I mean, the problem is that most likely that person does not have a pain problem. That person has an addiction problem. And or wanted to bring it to a head is a difficulty in finding drugs. It's a complicated thing we're in, but one individual can make a choice. You do it or you don't. And to my way of thinking, if you have a patient who clearly doesn't need these, I mean, I couldn't see why you would prescribe it. But the other issue just is really true that these guys from Mexico, if they had not had this business set up and take root in their community, they could easily have all been landscapers or restaurant workers or factory workers somewhere. It just so happened that a few families started. It took root. It made a lot of money. Everyone saw that it made a lot of money, and everybody got. And then the truth is that they were addicted themselves, just not to drugs. They were addicted to the feeling that they could come home, or live like urchins here in the United States, just work their butts off, and then go home with money and spend it and be the object of every man's respect and envy, and have all the girls talk to him, and that was a narcotic. That got addictive. That got into for kids who kind of were at the bottom of the economic totem pole. These guys were addicted to the idea that they could go home with Levi's 501s, with a new cowboy hat, with you know, and walk around, and all the girls would come talk to him. I mean, that for a 19-year-old kid, that is, I mean, that's intensely addictive. And you're right. The idea of finding their own American dream, heroin as the route to their own American dream, was part of the story. That was a story that I recognized earlier, though. It was the other stuff that took a while. The stuff that, because that was all about Mexico, I kind of understood the motivations there. It was the other stuff about the pills and the pain revolution that came later and made it, to me, just all the more important story to write.
Thank you so much for joining us and doing this with us. I really appreciate it, and really love your enthusiastic participation. It's so fascinating. Thanks, Rory, for setting this up. Thanks, Ruben, for helping to come up with the questions that were great. And you know, by all means, this doesn't need to be the end of the discussion. And we, as emergency medicine doctors, see this so much. And I hope other people read the book to get a better understanding, not just of the medicine, but the socioeconomic side of this whole epidemic. Thank you so much again. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.